Maggie Calloway signed the marriage contract with a hand that didn't shake because she'd decided somewhere between midnight and dawn that shaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. The pen scratched across the paper. Deputy Cresswell's foreclosure notice was still nailed to her door. Her daughter was asleep 12 feet away with no idea that by morning her mother would belong to the most dangerous man in Kansas. $1,000 of dead husband's debt. One signature. One stranger's name where her own used to be. Some doors don't open. They just stop being walls. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far Maggie's story travels. And if you've ever signed your name to something that terrified you because the alternative was worse, stay until the very end. What this woman discovers about the man they all called a killer will change everything you think you know about fear strength and what it costs to choose your own life. The foreclosure notice had been on the door since Tuesday. By Thursday, Maggie had stopped taking it down. There was no point. Cresswell's men just put another one up, and the new ones were printed on heavier paper like the courthouse had started ordering better stock specifically for her ruin. She left it there. Let it flap in the Kansas wind. Let every rider on the commercial road see it. She had bigger problems than her dignity. She had $940 of bigger problems, plus Cresswell's administrative costs, which rounded to an even $1,000, which was 4 years of good income from a way station that had never once managed a good year. Danny Calloway had bought the place on borrowed confidence and borrowed money, worked it with everything he had loved his daughter like she was the reason the sun came up, and then died in March at the bottom of a mine shaft, doing a favor for a man who wasn't worth the favor. He left behind 2 trunks of clothing, a 6-year-old girl with his eyes and Maggie's temper, and debts she was still finding like splinters under skin. Small, deep, invisible, until they went infected. The last one had surfaced 4 months ago. $600 borrowed against the way station title, sold by the original lender to Deputy Walt Cresswell, at a profit now sitting at compound interest, like a patient animal that had been fed and fed and fed and was finally ready to bite. Cresswell had come to the door himself, 2 men behind him. That told her everything before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Calloway." He tipped his hat with the deliberate courtesy of a man who enjoys the performance of it. "Outstanding balance is $940 plus administrative costs. Call it an even $1,000. 72 hours to pay in full or vacate. $1,000. I know it's a hardship." He didn't look like he knew anything of the sort. "If it helps, I have a buyer for the property. Good relocation offer, enough to get you and the little girl to Wichita. Start fresh somewhere with better prospects." "Whose buyer?" His smile didn't answer that. "Think it over. You've got until Friday." He looked past her into the way station like he was already measuring for new furniture. "Don't wait too long, ma'am. The property goes to auction if I don't hear from you, and auction prices are considerably less generous." He left. His men left. The foreclosure notice went up on the door and stayed there. Maggie stood in the middle of the way station floor and did the arithmetic she'd already done 100 times, the same arithmetic that came out the same wrong answer every time. And then she went to make supper because Lily was hungry, and hunger was a problem she could actually solve. "Mama," Lily said from the table, 6 years old, and already possessing her father's talent for timing, "is the stew going to be burned again?" "It's not burned, it's seasoned." "It smells the same as burned." "Eat your bread." She was scraping the pot when she heard hooves outside. Single rider. She moved to the window the way she'd moved to every sound since Danny died, the reflex of a woman alone on a road where alone had specific meanings. Nora Hatch swung down from her horse before it fully stopped, which meant she was carrying something. Nora only hurried when the news required it. Maggie had the door open. "How bad?" "Depends." Nora pulled a folded paper from her coat. "There's a telegram from Harlan Reed." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. "What does Harlan Reed want with me?" "Read it." She read it. 8 lines. No greeting, no pleasantry, no waste of words. Reed would assume her debt in full. Deed the way station clear. Monthly operating income sufficient to run it properly. His terms: legal marriage, minimum 1 year, formal settlement contract, guaranteeing her right to leave at year's end with the deed in her name, regardless of outcome. Response required within 48 hours. Signed, simply H. Reed. Maggie set the telegram down. "Say what you're thinking," she said. Nora sat without being invited, which was her way. "I'm thinking he's left 4 men dead that anybody knows of, and probably more that nobody counted. I'm thinking his ranch foreman disappeared 3 years ago, and the official story has holes in it you could drive cattle through." She glanced at Lily, lowered her voice. "And I'm thinking you've got a daughter and no money and 72 hours, and that telegram is the only offer that isn't Cresswell." "That's not supposed to be your argument." "I know. But you didn't come to me for comfort." Nora met her eyes steadily. "You came to me because you needed someone to say the thing you're already thinking." Maggie looked at her daughter. Lily had stopped pretending not to listen and was watching them both with the focused attention of a child who understood exactly how serious the room had gotten. "Lily, go wash up." "I already washed." "Wash again." Lily went. Her footsteps on the stairs were measured and slow, which meant she was listening from the landing. Maggie didn't call her back down. "Tell me what you actually know about him," she said. "Not the stories. What's real?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Chenshu's horses for the Reed operation. Says Reed pays better than any outfit in the territory and never once shorted a man's wages. Says he works his people hard but doesn't ask for anything he won't do himself. Says if you're straight with him, he's straight with you." She paused. "Says there's something in those eyes that scares people who don't know what they're looking at. But Marcus says it's not cruelty. It's damage. Old damage. The kind a man carries when he's made decisions he can't take back. That's a different thing than monster." "It is. Doesn't mean it's safe." Maggie stood, walked to the window. The foreclosure notice moved in the evening wind, patient and inevitable. "Why does Reed want a wife? A man with his resources doesn't need a marriage to solve a debt problem. He doesn't need the debt solved. He needs the way station." Nora leaned forward. "Think about it. Cresswell's been buying pieces of the main commercial road for 2 years. This way station is the last parcel he doesn't control. If he gets it, he owns the supply line between Dodge City and the Reed operation. Every delivery, every price, every access point runs through him." She paused. "That's not a property dispute. That's a slow stranglehold." Maggie turned around. "So Reed's not buying a wife. He's blocking a move. And you're the piece on the board Cresswell needs. Which means Reed knew about the debt before Cresswell moved on it." She looked at Nora directly. "Someone told him." Nora's expression went carefully neutral. "I may have written to Marcus Chen with certain information about certain timelines." "Nora, I didn't arrange anything. I just put the information somewhere it could travel." She held up her hands. "You can be angry at me after you're not about to lose everything." Something moved through Maggie that wasn't quite a laugh. She picked up the telegram. Read it one more time. 1 year. Deed in her name at the end. Leave if she chose. The fairness of it was almost insulting, a man like Reed offering terms that protected her when he held every advantage. Why? What kind of man builds a contract around a woman's right to leave Mama? Lily was in the doorway. She hadn't gone back to the landing. She'd come all the way downstairs, which meant she'd heard enough, and decided a direct approach was better than eavesdropping. 6 years old and already more pragmatic than most adults Maggie knew. "Are we going to lose the way station?" Maggie crouched down to her daughter's level. Lily had Danny's brown eyes, and Maggie's particular set to the jaw that meant stubbornness was baked in from 2 directions at once. "Maybe," she said. She'd made a decision in the worst weeks after Danny died that she would never lie to Lily about the things that mattered. Only the unsurvivable ones. "There's a man who's offered to help us keep it." But it would mean big changes. How big? Moving. Living somewhere different for a while. Lily considered this. Would you be there? Every single day. Then it's okay. Lily looked at the telegram in her mother's hand with the directness of a child who understood that paper sometimes meant everything. Is he scary? The man? Maggie looked at her daughter. Thought about everything that was true and everything she didn't know yet, and everything she was about to step into, with no map and no guarantee, and a 6-year-old counting on her to get it right. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'm going to find out. She stood. She picked up her pen. She wrote 3 words, arrangement accepted, Calloway, and gave the paper to Nora before she could think herself out of it. She served the burned stew. She did not sleep. The reply came at dawn. Wagon arrives tomorrow. Legal ceremony, Dodge City. Reed will be present. 11 words arranging the rest of her life with the efficiency of a supply order. She spent the day packing 2 trunks saying goodbye to neighbors with the compressed efficiency of a woman who could not afford to feel the full weight of what she was doing until she was already on the other side of it. The women from the church came with fabric and careful sympathy and voices pitched slightly too high, the way voices get when everyone in the room is working hard not to say the thing they're all thinking. Martha Hines waited until the others were occupied and pulled Maggie aside. Martha had been in Dodge City longer than the courthouse had been standing, and she chose her words like she was spending money she couldn't waste. My husband did 3 weeks of carpentry at the Reed Ranch 2 seasons back, she said quietly. Came home saying Reed was the most demanding employer he'd ever worked for. No tolerance for sloppiness, no patience for excuses. She held Maggie's gaze. Also came home saying he'd never been paid so fairly in his life. Said every man on that operation knew exactly where they stood. No games, no cruelty, no surprises. A pause. Said Reed worked himself harder than anyone he put wages to. First one on the ground, last one to stop. That's not the man they describe in town. No, but the man they describe in town never cheated on a contract or raised his hand to someone who didn't raise theirs first. Martha's expression went careful. Damaged men are their own kind of danger, Maggie. Not always because they're cruel. Sometimes because they're carrying something they don't know how to set down, and it falls on whoever's standing close. She squeezed her arm. Go in clear-eyed. That's all I'm saying. The wagon came at first light, driven by a weathered man named Tom, who said almost nothing and handled his team with the unconscious ease of someone who'd been doing it his whole life. Lily sat between Maggie and the side rail with her small bundle pressed to her chest and watched the Kansas landscape unroll around them with the focused intensity of someone committing it to memory. Dodge City was already moving when they arrived. Tom drove them to the courthouse without commentary and helped Lily down from the wagon with a rough gentleness that Maggie filed away without comment. He was already there. Harlan Reed stood on the courthouse steps, and the first thing Maggie thought before she could stop herself from thinking, it was that nobody had told her he would look like that. Not handsome. Nothing as simple as that. But built with the kind of authority that didn't require announcement. Tall, lean in the way of someone who worked rather than rested, dark hair gone silver at the temples, the bearing of a man who'd given orders for so long that stillness had become its own command. His coat was good wool slightly loose across the shoulders, like it had been cut for a heavier version of himself that the years had worked down. The scar ran from his right cheekbone to his jaw in a pale diagonal line, and his eyes, dark brown and careful, found her before she'd finished stepping down from the wagon. He came down the steps, removed his hat, looked at her directly. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was low-shaped by years of command into something that didn't need to be raised to carry weight. Harlan Reed. I know. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one like a man who'd forgotten the habit. Reckon you do. He glanced down at Lily, who was looking up at him with the unguarded assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't staring. Your face has a scar on it, Lily said. Lily, Maggie said. It does, Harlan Reed said without embarrassment or deflection. He crouched down to her level, which was not something Maggie had anticipated, and looked at her daughter directly. Does it scare you? Lily examined him with the gravity of a hanging judge. No, she said finally. Papa had a scar on his hand from a nail. Scars just mean something happened. She paused. What happened to yours? Long time ago, he said quietly. Doesn't matter much anymore. Lily considered this answer, apparently found it acceptable, and nodded once in the decisive way she had, the gesture so like Danny that it hit Maggie sideways and unexpected. Harlan Reed stood. He looked at Maggie, and in his expression she saw clearly and briefly that the child had done something to his composure that no adult in that town likely could. Judge Morrison's waiting, he said. You ready? No, Maggie said. But I'm here. His eyes held hers for a moment. That's enough. He offered his arm with the formal deliberateness of a man following a protocol he'd decided on ahead of time, and Maggie took it, because standing in the street not taking it wasn't going to solve anything. I keep contracts, he said quietly as they walked up the steps, not looking at her, eyes forward. Every word of what I sent you stands. 1 year. Deed in your name at the end regardless. And in between, his jaw tightened slightly. Nobody touches you on my watch. Not on my land, not in my town, not while you carry my name. That include Cresswell. He said the deputy's name the way you say the name of a problem you've been waiting to address. You've been watching him a long time, Maggie said. 3 years. He moves slow and covers it well. Hard to come at him direct. A pause. He thought you were isolated, thought the debt was the whole story, thought you'd take his relocation money and disappear before I could move. The faintest edge entered his voice. He thought wrong. What happens when he finds out about this? He already knows. His people in town are faster than good news. Reed held the courthouse door. He'll come at it different now. Can't foreclose a debt that's been cleared. But a man like Cresswell doesn't stop. He adjusts. He looked at her steadily. So do I. The ceremony took 6 minutes. Judge Morrison, a small, careful man with kind eyes, looked at Maggie with the gentle concern of someone who understood exactly what kind of choice she'd made and honored her for it anyway. Do you enter this marriage of your own free will, Mrs. Calloway? What did free will mean when every other door was locked and the building was burning? I do, she said. Harlan Reed said his vows the way he seemed to do everything, without embellishment, without performance, without a single word that wasn't load-bearing. No hesitation, no visible emotion, just the absolute undecorated steadiness of a man who intended every syllable. The judge looked between them with the expression of someone watching something he couldn't quite categorize, and announced them husband and wife. No kiss. Harlan Reed looked at her and said, "Wagons out front," and turned to lift Lily to his shoulder without asking permission, which startled all three of them. He set her down immediately, something flickering across his face like a man who'd moved on instinct and immediately questioned it. Lily looked up at him. "You can do that again," she said. "I don't mind." Something passed through Harlan Reed's expression that was there and gone so fast, Maggie almost missed it. Then he turned for the door, and the moment closed over like water. They rode in silence through the first mile, Dodge City falling behind them, and the open road rising ahead into rolling grassland. Tom drove. Reed sat beside Maggie on the wagon seat with the careful distance of a man aware of his own size in relation to others. Lily rode between them with her chin in her hands and watched a hawk work the thermals above the grass. After a while, Reed said without looking at her, "What do you want to know?" "Why aren't you angrier?" Maggie said. "About Cresswell. 3 years of watching him, and you're talking about it like a problem to be solved, not because anger is expensive, and I've spent it already." He glanced at her briefly. "Had 20 years of running hot after the war. Burned through everything around me. People partnerships sleep." He paused. Learn that cold is cheaper and more accurate. You pick your moment and you stay ready for it. A beat. Cresswell will have his moment. He just doesn't know which one it is yet. Maggie looked at him. The scar, the careful eyes, the quality of absolute stillness he carried even in motion. The stories they tell about you in town. Most of them are true. Flat matter of fact, not defensive and not proud. The men I killed needed killing. The ones I put off my land deserve to go. I've never cheated on a contract or raised my hand to someone who didn't raise theirs first. His voice didn't change. I've also made decisions I'll carry to the ground. Things done in the war and after that were legal and necessary and wrong, all three at the same time. A pause. I don't ask anyone to forgive me for those. I just try not to add to them. Maggie was quiet for a moment. That's an honest answer. Only kind I have. He looked at her directly for the first time on the road, and she held it because looking away felt like the wrong signal to send to this particular man. I'll tell you something else honest. I don't know how to do this. A beat, something rare moving in his expression. This. He gestured slightly between them, the most understated gesture she'd ever seen. I've run an operation with 60 men and never once been uncertain how to proceed. 2 hours married, and I've already picked up your daughter without asking, and I'm explaining my personal moral accounting to a woman I met this morning. He looked back at the road. So if I get something wrong, tell me straight. I'd rather know. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You asked Lily if your scar scared her. Yes. Most grown men don't ask that. They don't ask children anything. They just exist at them. She paused. That was a kind thing. He said nothing, but the line of his shoulders changed very slightly in a way she noticed and didn't comment on. Mama, Lily said without preamble, still watching the hawk. I like him. Harlan Reed's hands moved on the reins. Barely. But Maggie saw it. Give him a chance to earn that, Maggie said. I already gave it. Lily turned to look at Reed with the serene authority of a child who had decided something and was not open to revision. He asked me if he scared me. Nobody asks me things like I'm a real person. Papa did. You do. He did. She turned back to the hawk. That's enough for now. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Smaller somehow. More habitable. The ranch appeared over a rise in the low gold of late afternoon, and Maggie understood immediately that the stories had gotten the scale wrong. Not a ranch. A working kingdom built low and wide against the Kansas horizon, barns and paddocks, arranged with military precision cattle, dotting pastures that ran to the edges of vision, and in the center of it, on a slight rise above a creek, a house 2 solid stories wide, porch, real glass windows catching the last of the light like small fires. Standing on the porch, arms folded, looking at the approaching wagon with the stillness of someone who had been here a long time and intended to be here much longer, was a woman. Broad-shouldered, silver hair, eyes that assessed the wagon and its contents and reached conclusions before it had fully stopped. Reed set the brake. He climbed down and looked up at Maggie. Ruth Decker runs this house and has my full confidence. Anything she tells you is true. Any direction she gives is good. He held out his hand to help her down. She's going to look at you like she's deciding something. Let her decide. It matters what she lands on. Maggie took his hand, climbed down, and turned to face the woman on the porch. Ruth Decker came down the steps without hurrying, stopped in front of Maggie, and looked at her the way the telegram had looked at her, direct, without apology, taking in everything. So, Ruth said. Her voice had been shaped by Georgia and 30 years of hard miles since, and it carried both. You're the one he sent for. I'm the one, Maggie said. You look like you've been awake since Tuesday. Close enough. Ruth's eyes moved to Lily, who was already climbing down from the wagon with the independence of a child who preferred not to wait for help. She looked at the little girl for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a quality of recognition. One person who had survived things, looking at another person who was going to have to. "You hungry?" she said to Lily. "Completely," Lily said. "Good." Ruth turned back toward the house. "Come inside, both of you." Over her shoulder to Maggie, quieter. "He told me to make sure you had everything you needed. So you tell me what that is, and we'll see what we can do about it." Maggie followed her up the porch steps. Behind her, she heard Reed speaking to Tom in the low, efficient shorthand of men who'd worked together long enough not to need full sentences. She crossed the threshold of the house that was now for 1 year hers. The floorboards were solid underfoot. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking drifted from the back of the house. Somewhere above her, a door stood open to the evening air. She did not know this man she'd married. She did not know these people, or this land, or what the next year was going to ask of her. She knew that Cresswell was already adjusting his strategy, and that Reed was already thinking 3 moves ahead, and that her daughter had decided with the terrifying confidence of a 6-year-old that Harlan Reed was worth trusting. She knew she had signed her name to something that could not be unsigned. She lifted her chin and walked deeper into the house. Ruth Decker showed her the house the way a general shows a new officer the terrain efficiently without sentiment, every detail carrying operational significance. The kitchen ran the full back length of the ground floor and was Ruth's uncontested domain. The accounts room off the main hall was where the ranch's financial records lived, organized in a system Ruth had developed herself over 6 years and could explain to anyone willing to learn it. The upstairs held 7 rooms. Reed's was at the end of the hall with its own back staircase. Maggie's was the second door on the left, facing east, with a lock on the inside that Ruth pointed to without comment in a way that said everything. "Your daughter's room is next to yours," Ruth said. "I put them adjoining so she can come to you in the night without going into the hall." She opened the door to show a small room with a bed already made up a stuffed horse on the pillow that had not been there this morning and that Ruth did not explain. "Girl that age, new place. She'll need to know you're close." Maggie looked at the stuffed horse, looked at Ruth. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just don't let her run in the stables unsupervised. Reed's breeding stock is not for playing with." Ruth moved back into the hall. "Supper's at 7. Reed eats with the household most nights unless he's out on the range late. He doesn't require conversation at the table, but he doesn't object to it either." She paused at the top of the stairs. "He's not what people say he is." "So I'm hearing." "You're hearing it because it's true, and because it matters that you know it before you decide what to make of him." Ruth looked at her directly the way she seemed to do everything, without performance, without softening. "He's hard in ways that don't come undone. He'll never be easy company. But he's honest to his bone and he's fair, and in my experience, those 2 things are rarer than people like to admit." She started down the stairs. "Get your daughter settled. Come down when you're ready." Maggie stood in the hall for a moment after Ruth's footsteps faded. The house breathed around her solid walls, good construction, the particular quiet of a place built to last. She went to find Lily. Her daughter was already in her room, sitting cross-legged on the bed with the stuffed horse in her lap, examining it with the focused attention she gave to anything new and potentially trustworthy. She looked up when Maggie came in. "There was a horse on my pillow," Lily said. "I see that." "Who put it there?" "Ruth, I think." Lily considered this. "She seems strict." "She is. Papa was strict too." Lily set the horse carefully against the pillow, positioning it with the precise care of a child who had decided something was worth protecting. "Strict people usually mean it when they're nice." She looked at Maggie with Danny's eyes and a steadiness that sometimes made Maggie's chest ache. "Are you scared, Mama?" Maggie sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the last light was going gold, and the sounds of the operation filtered up from the paddocks. horses, men's voices, the rhythmic work of an evening routine that had nothing to do with her yet, and would have everything to do with her soon. "Yes," she said. "Of him. Of Mr. Reed." She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Not of him exactly, of getting it wrong. She looked at her daughter. Of making a mistake I can't fix. Lily leaned against her shoulder with the simple, devastating trust of a child who has decided her parent is sufficient for whatever comes next. "You don't usually get things wrong," she said. "I married your father. Papa was good. Papa was wonderful and a catastrophe." Maggie put her arm around her daughter. Both things were true. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Reed doesn't seem like a catastrophe." "No," Maggie said. "He seems like something else entirely." Supper that evening was the education she hadn't known she needed. The dining table seated 12 and had 8 people at it. Reed at the head, Maggie to his right, at his specific direction, Lily next to her, Ruth at the far end, running her end of the table with the authority of a woman who had earned her position at it. The ranch hands who ate in the main house were the senior men, Tom, who she'd met, a wiry, quick-eyed man named Cord, who managed the cattle operation, a younger man called Jesse, who handled the breeding stock and spoke about horses the way some men spoke about scripture. Reed made introductions with the compressed efficiency of someone for whom social ritual was a function rather than a pleasure. And then the meal began, and conversation moved around Maggie like water around a new stone, and she listened and learned the way she'd always learned best, by paying attention before she spoke. Reed ran his operation the way Martha Hines' husband had described. Direct. No games. When Cord mentioned a problem with the north fence line, Reed asked 2 questions, got 2 answers, and gave a decision that closed the subject. When Jesse said one of the mares was showing signs of a difficult pregnancy, Reed looked at him steadily and said, "What do you need?" Not, "What's the problem?" And the distinction was not lost on Maggie. "Mrs. Reed." Cord addressed her without preamble, the way a man addresses someone he's decided to take seriously. "You ran the way station operation yourself, after your husband passed. 2 years. Commercial road traffic supply management dealing with the freight companies. All of it." He glanced at Reed with the brief sideways look of a man confirming something. "We've been needing someone to renegotiate the Henley supply contract. Been overpaying on winter feed for 3 seasons because nobody's had time to sit across from Henley and make it uncomfortable for him." "Cord," Reed said. "She asked if there was anything she could do to be useful. I'm telling her there is." Reed looked at Maggie. The look was the question. "Tell me what the current terms are," Maggie said, "and what you think the right terms are, and I'll tell you if I can get there." Something moved in Reed's expression. Cord smiled for the first time all evening. Ruth, from the far end of the table, said nothing, but Maggie felt her attention shift and recalibrate in a way that registered like a change in weather pressure. After supper, after Lily had been put to bed with the stuffed horse and had fallen asleep with the instant totality of a child who had spent all her available energy on a new world, Maggie came downstairs to find Reed on the front porch. He was standing at the rail, looking out at the darkened ranch, a coffee cup in one hand, not relaxed exactly, but resting the particular stance of a man who has stopped working for the moment, but hasn't stopped thinking. She stood beside him, left appropriate distance between them. The night was clear and enormous stars blazing the way they did out here, away from town, and the sounds of the ranch settling into night came up from the paddocks and the bunkhouse and the dark. "You don't have to be out here," he said. "I know." She held her own coffee cup. Ruth had pressed it on her going up the stairs without explanation. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." "Ruth said you're not what people say you are." She looked at the dark instead of at him. "You said most of the stories are true. Those are different statements." Reed was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was thinking, not avoidance. "They're both accurate," he said finally. "The things I did happened. The reasons they say I did them are mostly wrong." He set his cup on the rail. "The war takes a man and shows him what he's capable of. Things you'd never choose in ordinary life become ordinary. After a while, you don't recognize where the line was." He paused. "I came back from the war, and I was very good at violence, and not much else. Took about 5 years of building this place to become something besides that." He looked at her briefly. "I'm still working on it." "What happened to your foreman, the one they say disappeared?" She felt him go still, not threatening something else. The stillness of a man who hadn't expected the question to come from this direction. "His name was Price," Reed said. "He was stealing from me. Feed contracts, wages, skimming everything he touched. When I found out, I fired him, took back what I could document, and told him to be off my land by morning." A beat. He spread the story that I'd done something worse because it suited him to have people believe it. And because people already believed the worst of me, it stuck. He looked at her directly. "That's the whole of it. No body, no crime. Just a dishonest man, and a story that was easier to believe than the truth." "Why didn't you correct it?" "Because correcting it required caring what people thought of me." He picked up his cup again. "I stopped doing that a long time ago." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "You should care what I think of you." He looked at her. "We're partners," she said. "That's what the contract says. Partners need to know who they're partnered with." She met his gaze steadily. "So, when something like that comes up, a story, a rumor, something that touches the operation or the household, I need the truth. All of it. Not the version that requires me to figure out what you left out." He studied her the way he seemed to study everything, with complete, unhurried attention, like he had the time to look at something properly and saw no reason not to take it. "All right," he said. "That's it. Just all right." It's a fair ask. All right means yes. The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll tell you when it's hard too, so you know it's not just the easy ones." She looked at him. The scar in the starlight. The careful, damaged eyes. The quality of a man who had burned through the version of himself that ran hot and come out the other side into something more deliberate and more honest, and considerably more alone. She thought about what Ruth had said. Rare. The two things together. "How long has it been," she said, "since you had someone to eat supper with that wasn't an employee?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. She saw it hit. He looked away back at the dark, and the silence was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Long time," he said finally. Quiet. No armor on it. She didn't push. She stood beside him and drank her coffee and let the night be what it was. 2 days later, Cresswell made his first move. He sent a man, not himself, which told her he was being careful, to the way station, with a notice that the property transfer was being contested on a procedural technicality. The notice was almost certainly invented, the kind of paper generated by a man with courthouse connections and a tolerance for delay. But it required a response, and the response required legal standing. And legal standing meant going to Dodge City, and standing in front of Judge Halsey, who Cresswell owned. Reed read the notice twice, set it down, looked at it the way he'd said he looked at problems, cold, precise, picking the moment. "He's testing the marriage," he said, "seeing if it's solid enough to hold up to a direct challenge, or if it was rushed enough to have procedure problems he can exploit. Is it solid enough? Yes. No hesitation. But Halsey will delay the ruling regardless. He needs time to find a different angle." He looked at Maggie. "I'm going into town tomorrow. You stay here. I'm going with you." He looked at her. "I'm the other party on the deed transfer," she said. "My presence in that courthouse is part of what makes this unambiguous. If I stay home because you told me to, it looks like I don't have standing to be there, which is exactly what Cresswell wants." She kept her voice level. "I'm not staying home." A silence. The kind of silence she was learning to read, not resistance, but recalibration. A man who'd made decisions alone for so long that the presence of someone who had standing to push back required a moment to adjust to. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected it that fast. "I know." "Don't look so surprised." "I'm not surprised. I'm noting it for future reference." She picked up the notice. "Who's our lawyer? Man named Aldous Grant. Office on 2nd Street. Honest, careful, hates Cresswell personally, which makes him motivated." Reed watched her read the notice. "You understand the procedural argument he's making. It's thin. He's claiming the debt assumption wasn't properly witnessed, but the telegram record and the courthouse filing both document it." She set it down. "He knows it's thin. He's not trying to win this challenge. He's trying to see how we respond to it. Whether we panic or lawyer up, or whether one of us does something intemperate that he can use." Reed looked at her with the focused attention that she was still getting used to the quality of a man who listened to the actual content of what you were saying, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "Cord was right about Henley," he said. "What? You'll eat him alive." It wasn't flattery. It was assessment. "Finish your coffee. I'll tell Ruth we're riding to town in the morning." She went upstairs. She stopped at Lily's room and looked in. Her daughter was asleep. The stuffed horse tucked under one arm, her face entirely peaceful, in the particular way of children who have processed the upheaval of a new life and decided it will do. Maggie stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter, and felt the full, complicated weight of everything she'd set in motion. The fear and the uncertainty, and beneath both of those things, something she hadn't let herself name yet, because naming it too early felt dangerous. Something that had to do with a man who listened when she spoke, and said all right, when she was right, and stood at a porch rail in the dark, admitting to loneliness, with no armor on it. She pulled Lily's door halfway shut and went to her own room. Through the wall she could hear Ruth moving in the back of the house, the low sounds of an operation settling down for the night. From somewhere outside, one of the ranch hands was singing something slow and off-key that the wind kept pulling apart. She lay in the dark and thought about the notice and the courthouse, and what Cresswell would do when the thin challenge failed, which it would, which he knew. She thought about what came after the testing, about what a patient, calculating man did when the first probe didn't find a weakness. She thought about Reed saying "long time" in that stripped-down voice. She thought about Lily saying he asked me things like I was a real person. She closed her eyes and told herself she was going to sleep. She mostly believed it. Judge Halsey's courtroom smelled of old paper and newer corruption, and Maggie knew within 30 seconds of walking through the door that the procedural challenge was never meant to be won. It was meant to be watched. Cresswell sat in the gallery, not at a table, not with a lawyer, just present in the second row, with his hat on his knee, and his eyes moving between Reed and Maggie, with the patient, calibrating attention of a man running calculations. He hadn't expected her to come. She could see that in the half-second before his expression settled. He'd expected Reed alone, which would have given him a particular kind of room to work in. A woman standing beside her husband in a courthouse, calm and legally present, closed that room entirely. Aldous Grant was a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and a deep personal dislike of procedural abuse that manifested as a very specific kind of quiet fury. He laid out the response to the challenge in 4 minutes: telegram record, courthouse filing, proper witness documentation. Every element of the debt assumption legally sound and properly recorded. Judge Halsey listened with the expression of a man receiving information he already had and didn't particularly want delivered in public. "The challenge appears to lack merit," Halsey said finally, in the tone of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was not gracious about it. "It lacks merit entirely, Your Honor," Grant said pleasantly. "We'd also note for the record that the challenge was filed without any supporting documentation whatsoever, which suggests it was generated not to address a legitimate procedural concern, but to create delay and public uncertainty around a legally settled matter. We trust the court does not intend to make a habit of entertaining such filings." Halsey looked at Grant, the way men look at other men who have just said something technically impeccable and personally infuriating. "Challenge is dismissed," he said. "Court is adjourned." Maggie kept her face still all the way out of the courtroom. It was only in the hallway, with the heavy door swinging shut behind them, that she let herself breathe. "Well done," Grant said to Reed, and then looked at Maggie and corrected himself. "Both of you." "He'll file something else," Reed said. "Undoubtedly. But this one's on this record as dismissed for lack of merit, which makes the next one harder to bring without looking like harassment. That matters particularly if this ends up before a territorial judge rather than Halsey." Grant gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man who had other battles today. "I'll send word if anything else lands on my desk. In the meantime, document everything. Every contact from Cresswell or his people. Dates, words, witnesses." He left. They stood in the courthouse hallway, and Maggie was about to speak when the door from the courtroom opened and Cresswell walked out. He was alone. He'd sent his men ahead, which meant he wanted this conversation to have no witnesses, and he'd done it with enough calculation that Maggie felt the hairs on the back of her neck respond before her mind had finished processing the implication. "Reed." He nodded. Then he looked at Maggie with a smile that was careful and cold, and said more than he intended. "Mrs. Reed, I'll admit I didn't expect you at the proceeding." "I'm sure you didn't," Maggie said. Cresswell's eyes stayed on her a beat too long. "I want you to know I have no quarrel with you personally. This is a business matter between men who've been operating in this territory for some time. You're new to it." His voice was almost kind. "Situations like this, it's easy to misread the landscape. Think you know who the reliable parties are when you don't yet have the full picture." "What picture would that be, Deputy?" "That Reed's operation has been in violation of 3 separate territorial water rights agreements for the past 2 years. That he's been running cattle on disputed grazing land since he bought the northern section." Cresswell's tone stayed conversational, a man sharing information as a courtesy. "I've been patient about it, but patience has a limit, and when a man starts blocking legitimate business activity through," he glanced between them, "unconventional arrangements, that patience tends to run out." Reed had not moved or spoken. He stood with the absolute stillness she now recognized as his most dangerous setting, not the contained cold he carried generally, but something beyond that, something that had stopped generating heat entirely. "The water rights filings are documented and current," Reed said. His voice was entirely level. "The grazing land was purchased with clear title 3 years ago, which your office certified. You were the filing deputy." A pause, so precise it could have been measured. "You want to take this somewhere, Walt, take it somewhere that has paperwork to support it. Otherwise, we're done here." Cresswell looked at him. Then he looked at Maggie, with an expression that shifted into something she didn't like. A recalculation, something being filed away. "Enjoy the win," he said pleasantly. "There'll be others to weigh it against." He walked out. The silence he left behind had a particular quality. Maggie stood in it and let her heartbeat return to something ordinary and thought about what had just happened. Not the legal challenge, not the procedural dismissal. The look. The way Cresswell had looked at her at the end, not with anger at losing, but with the focused attention of a man who had just identified the relevant variable. "He's going to come at me," she said. Reed looked at her. "Not at you. At me." She kept her voice even, because even was what the situation required. "He couldn't predict me being here today because he doesn't have a read on me yet. He's going to get one. He'll find a pressure point." She met Reed's eyes. "I need to know if there's anything in my history, the way station's history, Danny's debts beyond what I already know that he could use, because I'd rather know it from you than find out from him." Reed studied her for a moment. "There's nothing I know of that you don't, but I'll have Grant look at the way station records end to end. Anything Cresswell might find, we find first." "Good." She started for the door. "Then let's go home." She said it without thinking. The word just came out natural and unplanned, and she felt Reed go momentarily still beside her, the way he had in the wagon when Lily said she liked him. That involuntary, unguarded response that happened when something got through before the controlled surface could intercept it. Neither of them commented on it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that was almost deceptive in its ordinaries. Maggie learned the way station accounts in the mornings with Ruth, who taught the way she did everything directly without condescension, correcting errors once and expecting them not to recur. She sat across from Henley, the feed supplier, on a Tuesday and spent 45 minutes being professionally relentless until he agreed to terms that saved the operation $400 on the winter contract. Reed heard about it from Cord before she'd finished unsaddling her horse and said nothing to her directly about it at supper. But she caught him looking at her across the table with an expression she was beginning to understand, that focused, taking it in attention that meant he was adjusting something in his assessment of her. Lily attached herself to Jessie and the breeding barn with the purposeful devotion of a child who has found her people. Jessie, who was 23 and had no particular experience with 6-year-olds, handled it with the baffled goodwill of someone who had been adopted by a small determined animal and decided the best policy was cooperation. He taught her the horses' names. She taught him card games she'd learned from Danny. Reed walked past the barn one afternoon and found them both sitting in the hay with a deck of cards and the kind of mutual absorption that required no further management, and kept walking without disturbing it. Ruth watched all of it. Ruth watched everything with the comprehensive attention of a woman who had learned that paying attention was the most reliable form of protection. She said relatively little to Maggie about Reed directly, but she said things around the edges that Maggie collected like evidence. "He built me this kitchen," Ruth said one morning while they were working through the supply inventory. "When I came here, the kitchen was a disgrace. Single stove, no proper storage, no light. I told him what it needed. He had it rebuilt in 3 weeks." She didn't look up from the ledger. Never mentioned it again. Never reminded me of it. Just did it because I needed it and it was right to do. "You're telling me something." "I'm telling you the kitchen story." Ruth turned a page. "You can decide what it means." And in the evenings, in the particular quiet that settled over the ranch after supper, when the day's business was finished, and there was no more useful work to justify being somewhere other than where you were, Maggie and Reed fell into a habit that neither of them had planned, and neither of them named. The porch. Coffee. The dark. Conversation that started practical, the operation, the territory, the long shadow of Cresswell's next move, and sometimes, not always, moved into something else. Something without immediate purpose or strategic value. Just two people finding out who the other one was. She learned that he'd been 17 when the war started, and 21 when it ended, and that the 4 years between had taken something from him that he'd stopped expecting to recover. She learned that he'd read more than anyone would expect from a man who presented as purely practical, and that the books in his office had been read and not just collected. She learned that he'd tried to have a dog once early in the ranch's history, and the dog had died of a snakebite, and he'd never gotten another because the arithmetic of loss was something he'd gotten particular about. He learned that she'd taught herself to manage accounts from a book she'd borrowed and never returned, and that she considered this the best decision Danny had ever made, borrowing money from people who understood interest. He learned that she'd cried exactly twice since Danny died, once the night of the funeral, and once 6 months later when she found his handwriting on a piece of paper she hadn't known existed, a list of things he'd planned to do with Lily when she was older. He learned that she'd burned the list because looking at it was unbearable, and that she'd regretted burning it every day since. He listened to the last part without speaking, and when she was done he said, "I have letters from men I served with, men who didn't come back. I haven't been able to open them." He looked at the dark. "Been 14 years. She looked at him, at the scar, and the careful eyes, and the quality of a man carrying something he hadn't yet found a way to set down. "You'll open them when you're ready," she said. "What if I'm never ready?" "Then you'll open them anyway," she said. "Because ready is a story we tell ourselves. Most things worth doing happen before we're ready." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read yet. She was still learning the geography of his face, still building the vocabulary for what it said when it said something. But she thought it might be the particular look of a person who has heard a thing they needed to hear from a direction they didn't expect. "You're very direct," he said. "You said you preferred it." "I do." A pause. "I'm still adjusting to the reality of it." She almost smiled. "Give it time." It was on a Thursday 3 weeks after the courthouse that Cresswell found his pressure point. He found it through a man named Garver, who operated a freight company on the commercial road and who owed Cresswell enough money that his cooperation was guaranteed. Garver arrived at the way station, which Maggie still visited twice weekly, to manage the transition of the operation to a hired caretaker, with a story about a freight agreement that Danny had signed 6 months before his death, an exclusivity contract that, if enforceable, would require any way station on the road to give Garver's company first right of refusal on all freight movement. Garver's company being, as of 2 months ago, majority owned by a holding company that Cresswell controlled. The contract was real. Maggie sat with it at the way station table and felt the cold, specific clarity of recognizing a move that had been planned long before she'd known the game was being played. Danny had signed it because Garver had offered him a rate reduction, and Danny had never met a short-term benefit he could resist. The contract predated her marriage to Reed. It predated the debt assumption. It applied to the way station's operation, regardless of current ownership. She rode back to the ranch without stopping. Found Reed in the account room going over cattle records with Cord. Cord read her expression and left without being asked. She put the contract on the desk. Reed read it. Twice. She watched his face do nothing while he read it, which she now understood was not indifference but concentration. The cold, precise, picking-the-moment quality he brought to problems that required it. "He held this back," Reed said. "He's been holding it. Waiting until the procedural challenge failed. Waiting until he had something with actual teeth." She sat down across from him. "It's real. Danny's signature proper witnesses filed at the territorial office 8 months ago. Grant needs to see it. I've already sent for him." She looked at Reed steadily. "But I need to tell you something first. Before Grant gets here and it becomes about legal strategy." She kept her voice level. "Cresswell came to the way station himself this morning, before I found the contract. He came to tell me it existed." Reed went still. "He was polite," she said. "Very polite. He told me he wanted to give me the opportunity to understand the situation clearly before it became public. He said," she kept her eyes on Reed's, because this next part mattered, and she wanted to see his face when he heard it. "He said that a woman in my position, a woman who'd made a difficult marriage under difficult circumstances, shouldn't have to be caught in the middle of a business dispute between men. He said there were arrangements that could be made, that the contract could be managed if there was willingness to have a reasonable conversation." "He offered you a deal," Reed said. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume. That was she was learning when it was most dangerous. "He offered me an exit from you," Maggie said, "framed as a kindness. He said the freight contract gives him grounds to challenge the way station's operation, and by extension, the debt assumption, and by extension, our marriage settlement, and that if I came to the table separately from you without your lawyers, he could make sure I walked away with enough to start over." She paused. He was very careful never to make it sound like a threat, very careful to make it sound like a rescue. The silence was very specific. "Maggie." Reed used her name the way he very rarely used it, without the formal distance of Mrs. Reed, without the buffer of title. Just her name direct. "What did you tell him?" She looked at him across the desk that was covered in the records of an operation she'd spent 3 weeks learning to understand. In the house she'd spent 3 weeks learning to move through, beside a man she'd spent 3 weeks learning to read. She thought about the stuffed horse on Lily's pillow. She thought about Ruth saying rare. She thought about herself at that way station table, listening to Cresswell's careful, considerate voice, laying out her exit and feeling something that had surprised her with its clarity. "I told him," she said, that I had no interest in separate conversations or separate arrangements. I told him that I came to this marriage as a partner and I was staying in it as one, and that if he had a legitimate legal claim, he should bring it to Grant's office and stop coming to my door. She held Reed's gaze. And I told him that the next time he came to speak to me without my husband present, I would consider it a different kind of conversation entirely. Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have sent for me. You would have hit him." "Probably." "Which is what he wanted. He wanted you angry and reactive and documented as aggressive." She leaned forward slightly. "He's trying to separate us, Harlan. That's the whole strategy. He couldn't beat the marriage legally, so now he's trying to create a crack and get inside it. If you react the way he expects you to react, he wins the next round before it starts." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the anger that was real and legitimate, the cold precision that was his better instinct, and somewhere underneath both of those things, something else that she didn't yet have a full name for, but that had to do with the fact that she had called him by his first name without thinking about it, and he had not corrected her. "You're right," he said, for the second time since she'd known him, direct without qualification. "I know." She stood up. "Grant will be here by supper. We work the legal problem together on record visibly. Cresswell gets no cracks and no darkness to operate in." She picked up the contract. "And you stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" She met his eyes. "Like you're trying to figure out if I'm real." Something shifted in his face. Unguarded, brief, and entirely honest. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone paying attention?" She headed for the door. "I'll tell Ruth we'll need Grant's chair at the table tonight." She was in the hallway when he spoke. "Maggie." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for staying in it." She didn't turn around because turning around felt like too much right now, like a door she wasn't ready to walk through yet, even if she could see exactly where it led. "That's what partners do," she said. She went to tell Ruth to set another place at the table. Aldous Grant ate Ruth's cooking with the focused appreciation of a man who spent most of his meals alone and knew it, and then he read the freight contract twice, with the focused appreciation of a man who had just been handed something he could work with. "It's real," he said, which they already knew. "Danny Calloway signed it. It's properly witnessed, it's filed." He set it down. "It's also poorly drafted, which is the first piece of luck we've had. The exclusivity clause specifies freight movement originating from the way station property. It does not specify the way station's operator or owner, which means it binds the property," Maggie said, "not the person running it." Grant looked at her. "Correct. Which means if the way station is being managed by a third party under a lease arrangement rather than operated directly by the deed holder, the exclusivity clause may not apply to the current operational structure at all." He tapped the contract. Cresswell's lawyers drafted this, assuming Danny would keep operating it himself. They didn't anticipate a deed transfer and a leaseback arrangement. "Is that what we have?" Reed said. "It's what we're going to have," Grant said. "Retroactive to the date of your marriage, if you'll authorize me to draw up the paperwork tonight." He looked between them. "The way station is deeded to Maggie. Maggie leases operational management to a hired caretaker under the Reed Operations Administrative umbrella. The deed holder is not the operator. The exclusivity clause binds an operation that no longer exists in the form it was contracted." He allowed himself a small, precise smile. "It won't hold forever under scrutiny, but it will hold long enough for me to file a challenge to the original contract's enforceability on grounds of changed circumstances. Territorial courts have been sympathetic to those arguments lately." "How long?" Reed said. "To get a ruling, 3 months, maybe 4. Long enough that Cresswell has to decide whether to keep spending money on a case that's trending against him or find another angle." Grant closed his folder. "He'll find another angle. But every legal defeat costs him credibility with Halsey and with the Territorial Council, and credibility is what he's been trading on. We keep winning small, he loses big eventually." After Grant left the house, settled into its late-night quiet. Cord and Jesse had long since gone to the bunkhouse. Ruth had gone to bed with the decisive finality of a woman who had no unfinished business. Lily was deeply asleep, having extracted a promise from Jesse that morning that he would teach her to brush the new mare herself, and taking the promise with the seriousness of a legal document. Maggie was at the account room desk, going over the lease paperwork Grant had left for her review, when she heard Reed's boots on the stairs, not toward his room, but down toward the kitchen, which meant he wasn't sleeping either. She waited. After a few minutes, she heard him moving toward the account room, and she didn't look up when he appeared in the doorway, because she'd learned that Reed was a man who needed to arrive at things in his own time, and announcing that you'd noticed him arrive tended to interrupt the process. He came in and sat in the chair across from her and looked at the papers she was reading without reading them himself. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up. "About Cresswell and me. The part that's not about roads and freight contracts." He looked at the desk, not at her in the way he looked at things when he was deciding how much honesty the moment required. "I knew his father, during the war. Walt Cresswell Sr. was a supplier provisions ammunition, some of it legitimate, some of it running both sides of the line for profit. I documented it, reported it." A pause. "The report was buried by someone who was also profiting. The man never faced a single consequence." He looked up. Walt Jr. grew up watching his father run that game and walk away clean. He learned the lesson. Maggie set down her pen. "So this isn't just business." "It's business now. But it started as something I couldn't let go of. When I came back from the war and started building here, and Cresswell Jr. showed up in Dodge City with his father's methods and his father's confidence." He stopped. "I've been waiting for him to overreach long enough to bring him down clean. Legally. Without—" he paused on the word, "without becoming the thing people think I already am." She looked at him steadily. "That's why you didn't go after him directly when he moved on the way station debt. If I'd gone at Cresswell, the way my instincts told me to, I'd have confirmed every story he's been letting circulate about me for 3 years. He'd have had grounds for criminal complaint, territorial intervention, possibly losing the ranch." He looked at her. "I needed a legal move. Something that put me on the right side of the line, and him on the wrong side of it publicly on record. A beat. You were the legal move." She sat with that for a moment. "I was the legal move," she said. Not accusatory, just precise. "You were." His voice didn't flinch from it. "That was true when I sent the telegram. It was the honest reason." He met her eyes. "It's not the only reason anymore. I want you to know that, but I also won't pretend the first part isn't true. Because you asked me for honesty, and that's what honesty looks like even when it isn't flattering." Maggie looked at this man who could have dressed it up and hadn't. Who could have let her believe it had always been about more than strategy and chose not to. She thought about Danny, who had always found the most comfortable version of the truth to offer, not from cruelty, but from a deep instinct for avoiding discomfort, his own and everyone else's. She thought about how exhausting it had been sometimes to love a man who couldn't quite look at the hard thing directly. "I know," she said. "I knew from the beginning. The telegram was very clear about what the arrangement was." She picked up her pen again. "I'm not angry about it. She considered the word carefully. "Grateful for the version of you that tells me the thing that's actually true." He was quiet for a moment. "It's getting complicated," he said. "The arrangement." "Yes. For me." She looked up. His face was doing the thing it did when something had gotten through before the controlled surface could manage it, that brief, unguarded quality, like a window opened by accident in a house that kept all its windows shut. She thought about what she knew of him now. The war letters he couldn't open. The dog that died of snakebite. The kitchen he'd rebuilt because Ruth needed it and never mentioned again. The way he'd crouched down to Lily's level before she had any reason to. "For me too," she said quietly. Neither of them said anything else for a while. She went back to the papers. He stayed in the chair across from her, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just present in the easy, undemanding way that she hadn't expected from him and that she'd come to understand was its own kind of statement that he wanted to be in the same room she was in and was done pretending he had other reasons for it. Cresswell's next move came 9 days later, and it came sideways the way his best moves always did. He went after Ruth. Not directly. Cresswell was never direct when indirect would do more damage. He filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office claiming that Ruth Decker was occupying quarters on Reed Ranch property under an informal arrangement that violated a territorial statute requiring documented employment contracts for domestic workers, and here was the language, careful and clinical and designed to wound workers of non-citizen status. Ruth had full citizenship, had had it since 1866. Her papers were in order and had been since the day they were issued. The claim was entirely fabricated, constructed from misread statutes and deliberate confusion of dates, and it had absolutely no legal merit whatsoever. It also required Ruth to appear in person at the Territorial Land Office in Dodge City within 10 days to present her documentation, during which time the complaint created a public record associating her name with questions of legal status, which in 1873 in Kansas meant something specific and ugly regardless of the outcome. Reed found out about it before Ruth did, which meant he had approximately 20 minutes to decide how to handle what he knew would be her response to it. He sat in the account room with the notification in his hand and looked at it the way he looked at things when cold precision was fighting with something considerably hotter, and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Maggie came in, read his face and held out her hand for the paper. She read it, felt something move through her that was not the controlled strategic clarity she'd brought to the courthouse or the freight contract. This was different. This was a man using the most brutal instrument available, a black woman's legal status, her fundamental right to exist in her own place as a business tactic, because he'd calculated that it would cost Reed more emotionally than any legal challenge could. He knows, she said. He knows what Ruth means to this operation and to you, and he's using it because he's run out of moves that are purely about property. Yes. He wants you to react. I know. Harlan. She said his name the way she'd started saying it, direct, no buffer. Where is Ruth right now? Kitchen. Have you told her? Not yet. Then I'll do it. She stood up. He looked at her. You telling her will make it about your anger, she said. I tell her it's about her, what she needs, what we do next. She met his eyes. Let me. He looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention. Then he set the notification on the desk. All right. Ruth was at the kitchen table shelling beans with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything, and she looked up when Maggie came in and read her face the way Ruth read everything immediately, completely, without asking permission. She set down the beans. Show me, she said. Maggie put the notification on the table. Ruth read it. Her face did very little. That was the most frightening part. Not a reaction, but an absence of one, the specific stillness of a woman who had spent decades preparing herself for exactly this kind of thing, and had never stopped needing that preparation. When she finished reading, she set the paper down flat on the table and pressed her palm on it, a gesture that looked almost like she was holding it down. My papers are in order, she said. Her voice was level. Have been for 7 years. I know. Maggie sat down across from her, not beside her across so Ruth could see her face. This isn't about your papers. He knows your papers are in order. This is about making you spend 10 days under a public cloud and making Harlan watch it happen. Ruth looked at her. He picked me because he thought Reed would lose his head over it. Yes. And because... Ruth's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible evidence of what was happening underneath the controlled surface, because he thought I wouldn't fight it. That I'd want to disappear rather than stand in a land office and prove what I already know about myself. Is that what you want? Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of deliberate chosen clarity. "What I want," she said with a precision that had iron in it, "is to walk into that land office with my papers and my lawyer and my employer and my employer's wife, and make that man's fabricated complaint as public and as documented and as thoroughly dismantled as it is possible for a complaint to be." "Then that's what we do." "Reed won't like it. He'll want to—" "Reed will do what we tell him to do," Maggie said, "because we're going to explain to him clearly that the only response that costs Cresswell anything is the legal one, and that his job is to stand in that office looking like what he is, an employer defending an employee who has done nothing wrong, and let Grant do the talking." Ruth looked at her across the table. Something moved in her expression that Maggie hadn't seen there before. Not the measuring assessment of the first days, not the careful approval she'd been building piece by piece, but something more direct than either of those. Something that felt quietly and without announcement, like the particular recognition of one woman seeing another woman be exactly what the moment required. "You're good at this," Ruth said. "I'm getting better." "You were already good at it." Ruth picked up her beans again. "Go tell Reed before he does something that I'll have to clean up after." Reed's response when Maggie laid out the plan was exactly what she'd expected, a brief, controlled version of the thing he would have done without her, compressed into a single moment and then set aside. His jaw tightened. His hands stilled on the desk. He looked at the notification for 3 seconds with an expression that contained a considerable amount of things he was choosing not to do. Then he said, "Grant tonight." "Grant tonight?" she agreed. "And I'm in that land office." Standing behind Ruth and letting her present her papers and looking like a man who is present for a routine administrative matter and is puzzled about why it required a complaint. She held his gaze. Not like a man who wants to put Cresswell through a wall. His eyes met hers. "I do want to put Cresswell through a wall." "I know. That's why I'm specifying." Something shifted in his expression, that almost smile, the one that lived just at the corner of his mouth and came out rarely, and only when something had gotten through all his defenses and reached whatever was underneath them. "You're doing it again," he said. "What? Managing me." He said it without resentment, with something closer to wonder, actually, the tone of a man identifying something he'd never encountered before and wasn't sure yet whether to be grateful for or unsettled by. "Nobody's done that before, not successfully. Ruth does it. Ruth does what she wants and calls it household management." His eyes stayed on her face. "You do it differently. You explain the logic. You make me see the move before you tell me to take it." "Because I need you to agree with it," she said. "Not just comply with it. There's a difference." She picked up her pen to signal the conversation was settling. "One holds up under pressure, the other one doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her in that way. He had the whole attention of him undivided, which was something she'd stopped being able to pretend didn't affect her several weeks ago. "Maggie." She looked up. He was standing on the other side of the desk, and his expression had the unguarded quality that only appeared when he'd stopped monitoring it, when something had moved too fast for the controlled surface to catch. "The year," he said. "The contract year." She said nothing because she knew what he was asking, and she needed him to finish asking it. "You're at 4 months. His voice was very level, which she now knew meant the opposite of what level usually meant. "Cresswell's going to keep coming. This isn't going to be clean or quick, and I need—" He stopped. "I need to know if you're here for the duration of what this is actually going to be. Not the 1 year, the duration." The room was quiet. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch came through the window. Horses whined, the distant voices of men finishing a late task. Lily was asleep upstairs with her stuffed horse. Ruth was in her kitchen with her beans and her iron and her 7-year-old citizenship papers that should never have had to be proven to anyone. Maggie set down her pen. "The night Cresswell came to the way station," she said, "and offered me the exit, the rescue he called it." She met Reed's eyes. I knew what the right answer was before he finished the sentence. Not because the legal position was clear, or because the contract protected me, or because Grant could win in court. She paused. Because walking away from this would have been the wrong thing to do. Not strategically, morally. She held his gaze. And I haven't made a decision on pure strategy since Danny died, and I found out what pure strategy costs when the human part of it isn't accounted for. He looked at her. Something was happening in his expression that she didn't have full vocabulary for, yet something that lived deeper than the careful eyes and the controlled surface, something that the months of evenings and honest conversations and shared meals and the specific weight of two people learning to trust each other had been building toward. "I'm here for the duration," she said simply. He crossed the room. He didn't do it quickly or dramatically. He moved the way he moved through everything deliberate and fully committed once the decision was made, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up, and he took her face in both hands with a carefulness that she understood completely, because she'd watched those hands on horses, and on ledgers, and on her daughter's shoulder, always gentle, always purposeful, never careless. He kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he has finally let himself, when the decision has been fully made, and there is nothing held back from it. Not desperate, not rushed, thorough, like something that had been waiting a long time to be done properly. When he pulled back, his hands were still at her face, and his forehead came down to hers, and he breathed once like a man setting something down. He'd been carrying so long, he'd stopped noticing the weight. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. His voice had nothing managed about it. "I know." Her hands were at his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat steadier than she would have expected, and faster than he would have wanted her to notice. "Neither do I. We'll work it out." He pulled back enough to look at her. "We're good at working things out." "We are." She stepped back because the account room had Grant's paperwork in it, and tomorrow had a land office and Cresswell in it, and the particular luxury of standing still in the middle of something that had just changed did not extend indefinitely. "Talk to Grant tonight. I'll explain the plan to Ruth in the morning." She picked up her pen. "And Harlan." He stopped at the door. "Get some sleep," she said. "You look terrible when you haven't slept, and I need you to look like a man who is perfectly calm about a routine administrative matter." The sound that came from him was real laughter, brief and unguarded, and wholly unperformed. It did something to the room that she felt long after he'd gone. She sat down and went back to Grant's papers and told herself she was concentrating on them. She was not concentrating on them. The Territorial Land Office in Dodge City was a narrow room with good lighting and bad intentions, and Ruth Decker walked into it like she had been born to walk into exactly that room on exactly that morning and dismantle everything in it. Grant was already there with the documentation arranged in the order it would be needed. Reed stood to Ruth's left with his hat in his hand, and the expression Maggie had specified present calm, faintly puzzled by the inconvenience of it all. Maggie stood to Ruth's right. Cord had come too without being asked, which was the kind of thing Cord did. Jesse had stayed with Lily at the ranch, which was the kind of thing Jesse did. The territorial officer behind the desk, a man named Whitmore, who had clearly not expected this many people to show up for what should have been a routine intimidation, looked at the assembled group with visible discomfort. Cresswell was not there. Of course he was not there. Cresswell was never in the room when the consequences of his moves played out. That was the architecture of how he operated. He filed the complaint, he constructed the paper damage, and he waited somewhere comfortable for the results. Grant presented Ruth's citizenship papers. Grant presented her employment contract, which he had drawn up retroactively with Reed's authorization, and backdated to her first day of employment 6 years ago, which was legal because the employment relationship had been real for 6 years, and the absence of formal documentation was an oversight now corrected. Grant presented 3 affidavits from neighboring ranchers, attesting to Ruth's professional role and standing in the community. Grant presented the territorial statute Cresswell had cited, and then presented a 6-page analysis explaining precisely why it did not apply to Ruth's situation on any reading of the law that was not deliberately distorted. Whitmore read the documentation with the focused attention of a man who understood he was looking at something that had been assembled specifically to be unassailable, and was discovering that it was in fact unassailable. The complaint, Grant said pleasantly, appears to have been generated from a fundamental misreading of the statute in question, compounded by an apparent confusion about the dates relevant to Mrs. Decker's citizenship status. We trust this is the kind of error that, once identified, will be corrected promptly, and with appropriate notation in the public record. He smiled with the particular warmth of a man who wants the record to reflect exactly what kind of error it was. We'd also request that the record note the complainant for future reference. Whitmore noted it. He had the expression of a man who had just been handed a document he was going to have to file, and was already thinking about who was going to be unhappy about it. "Complaint is dismissed," he said. "Mrs. Decker's status and employment are confirmed as compliant with all applicable territorial statutes." Ruth received this information with the stillness she'd brought in with her. She thanked Whitmore with the precise, unembellished courtesy of a woman who knew the difference between genuine respect and the performance of deference, and was offering neither more nor less than the situation deserved. She gathered her papers. She walked out. On the steps outside in the Kansas morning, she stopped. She stood for a moment with her face in the sun and her papers in her hand and said nothing. Maggie stood beside her and didn't say anything either. After a while, Ruth said, "7 years. I've had those papers for 7 years, and I've never had to prove them to anyone." Her voice was level. "I knew the day would come. It always comes." She looked at the papers in her hand. "I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." "You weren't going to," Maggie said. Ruth looked at her. The particular look, the one Maggie had first seen across the kitchen table weeks ago, the one that had started as measuring and become something else entirely. "No," Ruth said. "I wasn't." She folded her papers with care and put them in her coat. "Let's go home." Cresswell's response to the land office defeat came within 48 hours, and it was the move that Grant had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. He went to the Territorial Council, not with a complaint, not with a legal challenge, with a political argument which was an entirely different and considerably more dangerous instrument. He presented to 2 council members the ones he'd been cultivating for years, a proposal to reclassify the commercial road between Dodge City and the northern ranches as a territorial infrastructure asset, which would place its management under territorial authority rather than private ownership, which would effectively nullify the way station's independent operational status and bring it under a regulatory framework that Cresswell, through his council relationships, could shape to his advantage. It was elegant. It was patient. It was the move of a man who had been planning this particular chess game since before any of the individual pieces knew they were on the board. Grant explained it to Reed and Maggie at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, while Ruth served coffee and listened without being asked to leave, because in this house, Ruth's opinion on operational matters was understood to be relevant and valuable, and no one had to pretend otherwise. "He's been building to this," Grant said. "The debt, the freight contract, the complaint against Mrs. Decker, none of those were the goal. They were pressure. Testing where you'd flinch, what you'd overreact to, where the cracks were." He looked at his papers. There aren't any cracks, which means he's moved to the instrument that doesn't require cracks. Political reclassification doesn't need you to have done anything wrong. It just needs 2 council votes and a sympathetic hearing. "Can we stop it?" Maggie said. "We can contest it. The process requires a public comment period and a full council vote, which means we have time and we have a forum." Grant looked at her. "The council responds to 2 things: legal argument and public opinion." "I can handle the legal argument. Public opinion requires people," Maggie said. "People who use that road and don't want territorial management of it and are willing to say so on record." "Every homesteader, rancher, and freight operator on that commercial corridor," Grant agreed. "If they show up at the council hearing and make clear that territorial reclassification threatens their operational independence, the political calculus changes. Cresswell's council members have to weigh his interests against constituent pressure and constituent pressure in an election year." "Wins," Reed said. Grant nodded. "Usually." Reed looked at Maggie. She was already thinking through it. She could see it in the way her eyes went to the middle distance, the specific focus she brought when she was running the problem. She'd been doing it for months now, across ledgers and legal documents and supply negotiations, and he'd long since stopped being surprised by the speed of it. He'd started relying on it, which was a different thing entirely, and one he'd stopped pretending not to notice. "How many operations are on that corridor?" she said. 14 that I know of. More if you count the seasonal operators." "I'll ride out this week," Maggie said. "Personally. To each one." She looked at Reed. "You stay here. Your presence at their doors makes this look like you're recruiting for your own interests. My presence makes it look like a neighbor who's worried about the same thing they're worried about." Which is also true. Reed looked at her. "Cresswell has people on that road. It's not safe to ride alone. Then send Cord with me. Cord and one other man. Enough that it's not foolish, not so many that it looks like an operation." She met his eyes with the steady directness that still, even now after all these months, did something to his composure that he hadn't entirely learned to manage. "I can do this." "I know you can." He said it simply because it was simply true. "I just don't want you to have to." That's different from saying I shouldn't. She held his gaze. "Right. Yes," he said. "That's different." She rode out the next morning with Cord and a ranch hand named Briggs, who had a quiet competence about him that Reed trusted. She was gone for 4 days. She came back with 12 signed statements of opposition to the reclassification proposal, 2 offers of alliance from neighboring ranchers who'd been watching Cresswell's movements and were relieved to find someone organizing against him, and a commission from a freight operator named Abilene Jack, who wanted her to negotiate his supply contracts on a retainer basis because he'd heard about what she'd done to Henley. Reed was on the porch when she rode in. He'd been doing paperwork. He set it down when he heard hooves. She swung down from the horse and handed Cord the reins and came up the porch steps and put 12 signed statements in Reed's hand and said, "How's Lily?" "Fine." She and Jesse named the new foal. "What did they name it?" "Biscuit." Maggie closed her eyes briefly. "Why?" "Jesse says he didn't name it. He says Lily named it, and he didn't feel he had standing to object. He has more sense than I gave him credit for." She sat down in the chair beside him, the one that had become her chair in the way that things become yours, without any formal designation, through repetition, through presence, through the simple fact of being there enough times that the space rearranges itself around you. She looked out at the ranch. 12 statements. Grant says we need 8 for the comment record to be taken seriously. 12 should make the 2 council members think very carefully about whether Cresswell's goodwill is worth the constituent problem. It will. Reed looked at the statements. Then he looked at her, the 4 days of road on her, the competence and the exhaustion in equal measure. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired." She leaned her head back. "A woman named Clara Hendricks on the North Road gave me her guest room for 2 nights and talked to me until midnight about her late husband. I think she needed to." She paused. "I didn't mind." He looked at her profile. The line of her jaw and the particular set of her chin that he'd learned was either determination or stubbornness, depending on the direction it was pointed, and was usually both. 4 months ago, she had been a stranger with a telegram and a 6-year-old, and debts she hadn't made herself, and she had sat across from him in a courthouse and told him she was terrified, but she was here, and he had understood in some inarticulate way that he was looking at someone worth knowing. He understood it considerably less inarticulate now. "Maggie." She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you something." He'd been working out how to say this for approximately 3 weeks, and had arrived at the conclusion that working out how to say it wasn't going to make it easier, so he was going to say it the way he said everything, directly without embellishment, and let it land where it landed. "The year contract ends in 2 months." She was quiet, watching him. "Grant can prepare whatever paperwork you need. The deed transfer is already clean. The settlement funds are available if you want Wichita or anywhere else." He stopped. "I'll honor every word of it. You know that." "Ooh." "I know that. she said. "But I want you to know something that isn't in the contract." He held her eyes. "I want you to stay, not because of the way station or the road or Cresswell or any part of the arrangement we made, because this," he gestured the same restrained gesture he'd made in the wagon on their wedding day, the most understated indication of something enormous, "is the most honest thing I've had in my life. You and Lily, and the way this house is now." His voice had the quality it only had when he'd stopped managing it entirely. "I'm asking you to choose it. Choose me, knowing the whole of what I am and what I've been and what it costs to be here." The porch was quiet. From the barn came the distant sound of Lily's voice, instructing someone, probably Jesse, possibly Biscuit, on some matter of great importance. The evening light was going gold across the ranch, and somewhere Ruth was making supper, and somewhere Grant was filing 12 statements of opposition that were going to give Cresswell a political problem that his council relationships couldn't fully absorb. Maggie looked at this man. The scar, and the careful eyes, and the war letters he hadn't opened in 14 years, and the kitchen he'd rebuilt and never mentioned, and the way he'd crouched down to her daughter's level on a courthouse step before he had any reason to. She thought about what she'd said to him in the account room, that she'd known the answer before Cresswell finished offering the exit, that it had been moral before it was strategic. She thought about Clara Hendricks talking until midnight about her late husband, the grief of it, and the love in the grief, the way that losing someone shows you exactly what they were worth. She thought about Danny, whom she'd loved truly and completely, and who had been wonderful and a catastrophe, and who had left her with a daughter and a debt and a set of calluses on her hands, from 2 years of working alone, and she thought about how she had never once, in all of that, felt the particular quality of being fully seen that she felt when Harlan Reed looked at her across a desk or a porch or a courtroom and paid attention. "I signed the first contract," she said, "because I needed to save something." She held his gaze. "I'm staying for a different reason." "What reason?" "Because somewhere between the courthouse and the freight contract and the land office and 12 homesteads on a 4-day ride, I stopped thinking about the year and started thinking about after." She paused. "Because Lily named a horse Biscuit, and apparently Jesse is now also her horse, and I'm not taking that from her. And because Ruth looked at me on those land office steps, and I understood that this place is something worth being part of." She looked at him directly. "And because I love you, Harlan Reed, which I did not plan and cannot fully account for, but which is true in the same way the freight contract is true, documented, witnessed, and not going away on a technicality." His face did the thing it did when something got through all of it, all the careful distance, and the managed surface, and the decades of practiced self-sufficiency, and reached whatever was underneath. Unguarded. Real. The face of a man who had stopped expecting something, and was being given it anyway, and did not quite know what to do with the fullness of it. He reached across and took her hand. Just that. Just her hand in his, held with the same carefulness he brought to everything that mattered to him. The council hearing was 3 weeks later. Grant presented the legal argument. 12 homesteaders and 2 freight operators presented their opposition. Reed sat in the gallery, present and visible and entirely calm. Maggie sat beside him. Cresswell's 2 council members looked at the room, ran their calculation, and voted against the reclassification proposal. The measure failed 4-2. Afterward in the hall, Cresswell found them. He looked different than he had in previous encounters, not diminished exactly, but recalibrated the expression of a man who has run a long game and arrived at the conclusion that the position is not winnable on current terms. He looked at Reed. He looked at Maggie. He looked at them standing together in a way that did not require any particular arrangement or staging, just 2 people who had fought the same fight and were on the same side of its outcome. "You built something," he said to Maggie specifically. He said it without visible emotion, the assessment of a man who gave credit because not giving it would be imprecise. "In 4 months, you built something I didn't see coming." "We built something," Maggie said. Cresswell nodded once, put his hat on, and walked out of the territorial courthouse and did not look back. Grant said later that he thought Cresswell would leave the territory. Reed said he thought Cresswell would stay and find a smaller operation to prey on, because men like that needed a territory, and this one was the one he knew. Maggie said it didn't matter because what mattered was that the road was clear and the way station was operational, and Ruth's papers were on the public record as uncontested, and that was what they'd come to do. Nora Hatch came to the ranch that Sunday, which was the first time she'd visited since the wedding, and she sat on the porch with Maggie and drank coffee and watched Lily and Jesse in the paddock below, where Lily was demonstrating to Biscuit with great confidence how a horse ought to stand. "Well," Nora said. "Well?" Maggie agreed. "You look different than you did 4 months ago." "I am different than I did 4 months ago." Nora looked at her with the clear-eyed attention of a woman who had known her through the worst of it and was now looking at the after. "Good, different." Maggie thought about the account room and the porch and 12 homesteads and a courthouse hall and the particular quality of a man who told you the true thing even when the comfortable thing was available. She thought about Ruth saying rare. She thought about Lily below them in the paddock, explaining something earnest and important to a horse named Biscuit, while Jesse nodded with the solemn attention of a man who has accepted that this is his life now and found it sufficient. "Yes," she said. "Good, different." Nora nodded. She looked out at the ranch, the barns and the paddocks and the solid house, and the operation that ran from first light to last, with the particular energy of something that had been built to last and knew it. "I'm glad I wrote that letter," she said. "So am I." Maggie looked at the horizon. "Don't tell anyone I said that for at least a month. I have a reputation to maintain." Nora laughed. Maggie almost did. Reed found her that evening in the garden on the west side of the house, the one that had been neglected when she arrived, and that she'd been working on in the margins of everything else, not systematically, not with a plan, just with the persistent attention of someone who believes that growing things is worth the effort, even when the results are slow. She had her hands in the dirt, and the last light was going amber, and she didn't hear him come because Reed moved quietly enough that you only heard him when he wanted you to. "Grant says the deed paperwork will be finalized Thursday," he said. "Good." He sat on the low fence beside the garden, looked at what she'd done with it. "You don't have to keep working on this," he said. "We have people who could—" "I know." She kept her hands in the soil. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "Lily told me this morning that she's decided Biscuit is going to be a cutting horse. Biscuit is 4 months old and mostly interested in eating. I mentioned this. She said it was a long-term vision." He paused. "I told her that long-term visions require patience and consistent work over time. She said she knew that. She said her mother taught her." Maggie sat back on her heels and looked at him. The scar in the evening light and the dark eyes that had stopped being careful in the specific way they'd been careful at the start. Not because the damage was gone, but because he'd stopped keeping all the windows shut. She had done that. They had done it together. She said that, verbatim. She looked at her hands in the dirt of a garden she'd planted in a place she'd arrived at with nothing but a contract and a decision and a daughter who trusted her to get it right. She thought about what it meant to build something. Not the way she'd thought about it before, as survival, as holding on, as not losing what was already slipping, but the way she understood it now. As a choice made daily, as a thing that required showing up and staying in it and telling the truth, even when the comfortable version was available. She stood up. She crossed to where he sat on the fence, and she looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him from the start, without flinching, without performance, with the full, honest weight of what she knew and what she felt and what she had chosen and intended to keep choosing. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had on the porch 3 weeks ago. Just the fact of it. The warmth and the weight and the carefulness that was not timidity, but its opposite. A man who had learned that the things worth holding deserved to be held properly. "I know," he said. Below them, the ranch settled into evening lights coming on in the bunkhouse and the barn. Ruth's kitchen glowing warm from the back of the house, Lily's voice carrying up from the paddock in one final confident address to Biscuit before Jessie carried her in for supper. The Kansas sky went from gold to rose to the deep clear dark that Maggie had learned to love. The dark out here that was nothing like any dark she'd known before, enormous and full of stars and completely without threat when you were standing in a place that was yours. Maggie Calloway had signed a contract to save herself and her daughter, and had ended up building something she hadn't known she was looking for. A life made not from what circumstance had handed her, but from what she'd chosen to do with it, in a place that had asked her hardest, and found her sufficient with a man who had told her the true thing always, and loved her for doing the same. She had come to Kansas with a dead man's debts and left fear behind her somewhere on a 4-day ride between 12 homesteads, and what she had built in its place was not fragile, and was not temporary, and was not anyone's to foreclose. It was finally, and without apology, home.